In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. According to most theological cemeteries, this is no longer true because they have all been raised in the American re-education system and taught that evolution is the reason why we are here. And we have with us, again, Bruce Malone, a scientist, a man for 30 years making his life with Dow Chemical Corporation, 18 patents under his name, international patents, a real scientist who is taking us back into the scriptures to understand the physical universe in which we live. And my question to you, Bruce, is, did God use evolution? Because this is what's being taught from the pulpits, that God used evolution in order to create the world.
Well, in order to answer that question, we have to define, what do we mean by evolution? You see, that word is used in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, because both of us believe in evolution, don't we?
We do. We are strong evolutionists.
Strong evolutionists. I admit it.
You see, the way children are trained to start believing in this idea that bacteria turn into people is to be shown examples of how there are lots of variety within life. In other words, bacteria have enormous variety and they can actually mutate and become resistant to drugs. That's evolution. Lots of variety of dogs. You've got Chihuahuas to Great Danes and everything in between. And they say, hey, see, that's evolution of the dog kind. But dogs stay dogs, bacteria stay bacteria, people stay people. If you use evolution to just mean there's variation, well, God built the DNA code to give lots of variety. He doesn't want every person to look like a cookie cutter and every other person. He is a creative God. But so that kind of evolution is true, variety within a given created kind of creature. But 10 times God said He created creatures to reproduce after their own kind. Cows reproduce after their own kind. Birds reproduce after their own kind. Trees reproduce after their own kind. He said it 10 times. So we're evolutionists. We believe that there's variation within a kind.
That's right.
But when you now use the same word to mean something completely different, that a kind could change into a totally different body structure by random changes, that is not observable by science.
Right.
And that has never happened. That is fantasy.
That's a fantasy.
So
that's
we've
right.
got to train our children to separate how that same word is used in two completely different ways. One is true, the other is fantasy. Okay?
Okay. Give us some examples of that.
I will give you an example of how clear our mighty Creator and Redeemer wants the truth to be. When we as scientists go and we look at, well, what is life? Could it have made itself? And we're totally honest with what we find, the answer is incredibly obvious. Life could never make itself. Let me demonstrate.
Okay.
You go into every textbook of biology and it'll start on a section of biological evolution, chemical evolution. How could chemicals have come alive? And they'll see this experiment where a man named Stanley Miller in 1952 put gases, methane, ammonia, in a cylinder, and he circulated them. And then he added like an explosive spark, and he formed in this flask things called amino acids. Now, for sake of just visual clarity, we're going to think of these balls as an amino acid. He made some of these balls. Now, there are lots of different colors you'll notice here in this container, because these balls link up, like I've shown here, they just kind of link up to form a chain. And the different colored balls are like different amino acids, but they have to link up in an exact order. And you have to have 20 different kinds of amino acids, 20 different colored balls. And then they form what's called a protein. Now, a protein is like the most common chemical that everything's made out of. Bacteria, trees, animals, fish, our bodies, they're made out of. Our bodies have about 200,000 different arrangements of these colored beads. Now, again, for clarity, thank you for catching my amino acid. I have a model of what a very long protein might look like. Now, you'll notice this chain has lots of colors. Each of the beads is like an amino acid. They're linked up in a specific order. You have a blue one and two clear ones and a yellow one and a purple one and a brown one and so on. If they're not in the right order, this protein chain doesn't bend and fold the right way. I mean, it has to be a certain order to be your hair. It has to be another order to be your skin. It has to be another order to be hemoglobin in your blood. Let me show you what just one of these protein molecules might look like. Now that's just one protein molecule. There are 200,000 different molecules, each specifically designed, and every color on every one of them has to be in exactly the right spot. How could that happen? Now, when you saw that protein chain coming out, it just went on and on and on. That's a fairly complex 2,000 amino acid protein. Every single one of those beads had to be in exactly the right spot. If even one of them was wrong, if a blue one was switched with a yellow one, that's a disease called sickle cell anemia if that protein was the hemoglobin in our blood that carries oxygen. And then the whole chain doesn't bend and twist quite right because one of them was in the wrong spot. And most people would die of that disease. Now, as you look at this simple model of a protein, pretend just random chance, just evolution's trying to make a protein. And in order for it to function, it's got to be this protein that has a blue amino acid, a green, or a red, purple, yellow, and then another red. All evolution has is a random chance. So somehow random chance has to reach into the container and pull out a ball and put it there. And it has to be exactly the right color at exactly the right spot. It's wrong. It's not even one of the right colors. It's the wrong amino acid. See, statistically, when these amino acids were made, they were all kind of the wrong kind of amino acids. They were the wrong colors. They're the wrong shapes.
In this experiment.
They got a few of the 20 that were needed, but they never even got all the ones they needed. And then they got all sorts of stuff in this experiment that would have stopped the protein chain from linking up. And chance could never put them in the right order. It's like everybody has played with Lego blocks. You know, Lego blocks, they kind of link up. They're different colors. And kids love them. You got a red one, and then you reach in and you grab an orange one and then a green one. And they link naturally. But when this experiment was done, they created a bunch of formaldehydes. It's a chemical that would stop the linking up of these amino acids. Those would be like an end cap. You put an end cap, a little person that doesn't have the little nubs on him. Now you can't continue to make it. That experiment would have made 10 times more of the end caps than it did the Lego blocks. So everything we learn when we start to understand this experiment says life could not possibly have happened in this way. It's all deception.
That experiment, which they tried to use to prove that life could just happen, actually proved just the opposite, but that is not how it's being reported.
That was
not what's in the textbook.
65 years ago.
That's right, 1952.
And why would it still be in the textbook when it has all these problems? They excluded oxygen, you got the wrong amino acids, you got a bunch of stuff that would stop proteins from forming, you can't get them in the right order, all these problems, and it's still in the textbook because they've never found even a remotely better explanation. And what they have found doesn't work. Do you understand how?
So they have to use that, and they have to lie about it in order to promulgate their fairy tale.
God wants the truth to be known. There's certain things He did. He created life, and He created very different forms of life. And when we observe creation, we find out it is exactly true. But those things are hidden from the students. They're not shown the problems with the experiment. They just pretend this is how life started on Earth. And it's deception. It's not education, it's indoctrination into an atheistic worldview. Now, even if you had all of the parts that you needed for life, all these complex chemicals, could life form? People are under the impression that in laboratories, scientists are making new forms of life all the time. Well, let's do another experiment, because science is about experiments, and let's see, could a complex machine come together all by itself? And I like to call this experiment the magic can of evolution.
Oh, you have a
I've got
magic
a monkey on
evolution
one
can.
side.
Excellent.
I've got my human being thoughtfully thinking on the other side. Let's just see what the can will do. And I think we can perform this experiment even while we're sitting here at the desk. You notice in the can, we have a pin. Now, a pin is a little machine. I kind of like this one because it says, search for the truth. That's what we should all be doing.
Okay.
So
that's the name of your ministry.
It happens to be. But this machine, this little complex machine we call a pin, has a lot of parts. It's got a tip specifically designed and molded by intelligence. By the way, this is way less complex than the molecules of life. which we also don't find naturally. It had to be created and designed. Has a spring, has an ink cartridge, and then inside the pen.
And there's actually ink in that tube, isn't
Well,
there?
there's more than it's more than just 7 parts, because
Wow.
the ink cartridge has a metal tip and then has ink, but we'll just call it 1 part.
Oh, okay.
Then we got the tube and the clip and the button, so it goes click, 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 and then we got the little mechanism. So I put all the parts for our little machine into the magic can of evolution.
I bet if you shook that for 100 years, you'd have a completed pen.
You think?
Maybe
I think it might take a little
million?
while. Actually,
A billion?
you think time is the answer, because the more I shake it, the more the parts are going to wear down. So time is going to make the problem worse, not better. So, but it's an open system. Energy can come in and out. So in that famous Miller experiment in 1952, they added explosive energy. So we'll add explosive energy to our magic can of evolution, because in science you have to do experiments, and we'll just see what happens.
All right.
And I happen to have a firecracker that I brought with me here today. So instead of just shaking the can and adding lots of time, we're gonna add some explosive energy. Okay, there we go. Drop her in the can and wait. You know, gotta wait for these things in science, and there we go.
Whoa!
We blow the lid off the can, and when you do experiments, you always have to look and, man, I hate it when this happens, but there's the reassembled pin.
That's incredible. All it took is energy. Add energy and...
No, when I
Wow,
do this
that's
demonstration, you know, in churches or schools, you know, the students, they just burst into huge, outrageous waves of laughter, because they understand what they just saw was absurd. It was the absolute height of absurdity that energy, just random energy input, could reassemble a complex machine. You understand there were 2 pins in the can. I just had a fully assembled pin hidden. Now, think about our education system in the Western world, Europe and America, and we influence the education in all the other areas of the world too. The students are systematically being taught that something 1 billion times more ridiculous than what you just laughed at, that just 7 parts of a pin could come together by random energy, that the way more complex, way more numerous parts of life, and the simplest single-cell bacteria has hundreds and hundreds of specifically designed parts that don't occur unless they're made by living organisms. The parts of the pin don't occur naturally. The parts of life don't occur naturally. That all that just assembled itself because of some explosion, some Miller's experiment, some strike of lightning.
And they have just pulled a fully assembled pen and substituted it and saying...
It's life, life
this
instead
is
of the
how it
pin.
happened.
But it's way more
Yeah.
complex. Life's
Right,
far
yeah.
more complex. It's
Perfect.
absurd. It's absurdity. And we laugh at it when we see it, and yet we allow it to be taught to our children. You know, every experiment ever done, and we have spent billions of dollars in laboratories trying to make life occur, trying to create life, trying to get chemicals.
Billions?
Oh, yeah, for the
Billions of
last
dollars?
100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, all these biochemical laboratories, all these experiments, thousands of scientists, generations of work, going clear back into the 1800s, trying to get chemicals to come together to form life, trying to understand the chemistry of life. Every single experiment ever done has the same result. Life never forms by itself. Even with lots of intelligence involved, we can't make life form. See what science is showing us? God is the only possible explanation that makes sense.
Yeah,
and he told us that's what he did.
That is what science tells us, that God is the only reason, only explanation at all.
Okay, now let's move along in the biological world. I want to give you another just poignant example see, the problem with trying to combine evolution with the Bible and saying, well, God just used evolution. He used the process of evolution to make us, is that the very mechanisms of evolution do not work to explain life. And I want to explain this with a simple creature called the leafhopper. Now, you'll see on the screen, there's a picture of a leafhopper. It's like a grasshopper. I like to call it the Olympic athlete of grasshoppers on steroids, because it can jump, baby. I mean, like nothing else. Its whole body's built to jump with these huge, long hind legs. And the little baby's called a nymph. It's so small, it's like the head of a pin. When it takes off, it accelerates 100 times the acceleration of gravity, 100 G-forces. Now, They test pilots when they're going to fly in jet airplanes to see, can they take high acceleration and banking speeds and so on. When the human body hits about 10 Gs, we're in danger of blacking out. The blood's being shoved out of our faces. I mean, here's a picture, you'll love this, of people in this centrifuge spinning around with 10 G-forces shoved against them. And if you look at that, it's laughable. Their whole faces are pressed back because of the force. Our leafhopper takes off 10 times faster than that. It's like a bullet coming out of a gun. He just literally disappears when he jumps. So here's the problem. Biologists are watching this and they're thinking, that's kind of cool. And you got this little insect, he's walking along in the forest one day and his brain says, jump. Well, that signal has to go down his back and split and go to the right leg and the left leg. But he moves so fast that statistically one of those legs is going to move faster than the other. That's how fast his muscles respond. One of them is going to move faster. So if he's moving like a bullet coming out of a gun and one of his legs is shoving faster than the other, is he going to go in a straight line? He's not. He's going to go sideways. His brain's going to smash against the tree. They're going to go flying over the forest. It's not going to work. It's an unworkable system. So the scientists are thinking, where did this animal come from? They dissected him. They did electron microscope pictures. I think I like this example because my background's engineering. This is what they found deep down inside of that insect. And I think your folks watching will be astounded. It's a set of gears, perfectly formed gears, a right-hand gear and a left-hand gear attached to the right leg and the left leg, so that if one of those legs starts to move faster than the other, it forces both legs to move in perfect unison. They look like they were made in a machine shop by human beings. They're perfectly formed on a microscopic level, little tiny gears. Now, someone who's trained, evolution's a fact, millions of years, billions of years, that's how they're trained to think. They're going to see those gears and they're going to say, wow, look what evolution did. And they think they've answered the core problem. They might as well be saying, wow, look what gobbity goobity boop did. They just made up a word. It doesn't explain anything unless you explain how evolution did it.
Right, right.
Evolution supposedly works by random changes, arranging amino acids. If an animal has a random change, it has some advantage, and this does happen occasionally. You know, you have variations in fish. Some fish like cold water, some like warm water. The ones that like cold water survive better there. If that happens over and over again over millions of years, that animal will change and it will become a different animal, and that's taught as a fact. Random changes, advantages. Let's think about these gears. You know, inside of this animal that didn't have the gears, there must have been something. Maybe they were just kind of a couple tumors. You know, they're not locked together. They don't have fins. They don't shape like gears. Even if they're round, how do you turn those into gears? A mutation is like hitting something with a hammer. It's a random change. Going into a machine shop and you hit a piece of metal. Hit it again, time after time after time. Even if you hit it for millions of years, is it going to turn it into a gear with fins? And they've got to be a right-hand gear and a left-hand gear. And they've got to perfectly intermesh or they would just lock up and the animal would go extinct. And they've got to have muscles attached to them. And they've got to have tie-down points. And they've got to have signals that go to the brain. And they've got to have instincts that tell the animal what to do with these new gears. It all has to be there at once by randomly hitting it with a hammer. You see, the mechanisms of evolution don't work to explain these features we find in these animals. That insect had to be fully formed, fully functional with everything there at once. And that's what God told us. In 6 days, I made the heavens, the earth, and all that they contain.
So this is incredible that mankind has invented the electron microscope.
Right.
So that they can find something that is
invisible.
Invisible, can't even describe how this could come about without there being a creator. So really that electron microscope shows the handiwork of God that is far beyond the ability of a man to even manufacture something on that scale.
The height of denial going on in our education system would be like finding that electron microscope buried in the ground and pretending it made itself. That's the kind of thing we're doing with our young children.
Yeah.
And yet, as I mentioned earlier, the man who spent his life studying how the human brain works First one to teach psychology at Harvard University. After boiling down a lifetime of work, he said, there is nothing too absurd to be believed by human beings if you just repeat it over and over and over again. That chemicals could come alive, that the DNA code could write itself, that the leaf hopper gears somehow could come about by a random change of mutations. And it's all absurdity, but it's taught over and over and over and over again in our school systems to the point it becomes reality to these students, and then they become the teachers. And the truth becomes silly to them, the idea that God literally created life. They think that's silly because they've been trained to leave it out of their thinking.
It's kind of like, you know, you send your children off to school to learn this stuff and not arming them otherwise is basically like telling them that Santa Claus exists and continuing to tell that fairy tale over and over and over because you want their children to fit in with the other children that believe in Santa Claus when they're still 12 years old.
It's a very similar thing. It's a tragedy. I think it's almost a form of child abuse. When you know something isn't true deep down, you know the evidence doesn't support it, but your faith is in future discoveries instead of current observations. That's what's really going on. Now, when I left Dow, I worked there for almost 30 years. I spent my first 2 years, and I wrote a book called Censored Science, The Suppressed Evidence. Now, this is the kind of stuff.
Beautiful.
Well, it is. It's a book where every page is a different topic. This page deals with insects and how they could have come out. This deals with hearing, the complexity of even a single organ. The first third is about biology, the middle third's about geology, the last third's about cosmology. It's kind of the 50 best evidences from creation that have never been refuted. And this is the kind of resource parents need for their friends and skeptical neighbors and relatives, so they can see science actually supports the Bible. It doesn't contradict the Bible.
One evidence, one scientific law to the contrary would then negate that reality.
In reality, it does. But the way science, honestly, the way science works is it takes observations, it fits them into what it thinks explains it. When enough observations fit that explanation, it becomes a scientific law if nothing ever contradicts it. That should make us very confident that we have the truth and point us in the right direction. And that's what I am saying a true interpretation and understanding of the evidence does. It gives us laws of science. There's a law of biogenesis that Louis Pasteur developed that said life only comes from previously existing life. Never been contradicted. That means life couldn't have made itself. See, the law of science points us to a creator. There's a law of science that says matter and energy can't make itself. Never been contradicted. That points to the fact that the universe couldn't have made itself. There's got to be a creator. And there's enormous problems with the idea that one animal could have turned into another that's just hidden from students. But scientists will say, well, we'll just continue to study and continue to learn and continue to get more observations, and eventually we'll show how it all made itself. See, that is actually faith masquerading as if it's science. Science should be based on experimentation and reproducible observations.
Contrary to popular opinion, science is not about disproving the Bible. In fact, science proves that the Bible had it right from the beginning.
If you leave out what God has told us, you're starting from the wrong assumption. You're starting with misinformation. You're almost guaranteed to come to the wrong conclusion.
Through logic, creative prompts, and profound scientific reasoning, Michael Rood and Bruce Malone demonstrate that evolution is not a science at all in Creation versus Fake Science.
The height of foolishness is denying God's existence. And that's what all of modern science, by definition, has decided to do.
Learn from Michael Rood and Bruce Malone why creation is the only option that makes sense. Order Creation versus Fake Science right now on DVD or Blu-ray. You'll get all 4 episodes as seen on Shabbat Night Live. Order Creation versus Fake Science now by phone or online.
You know, we had something happen on the set while we were gone, and we had the spontaneous generation of a rubber chicken. And so we're here to explain how this can happen, how apes can turn into people, and how chickens can, rubber chickens can spontaneously generate here on the set. We have with us again, Bruce Malone. Bruce.
Thank you, Michael.
So how did we get here? We were once just hanging in the trees, having a good time with a tail, and which I would find extremely useful to still have. But how did we end up in such a condition as we are now, wearing a suit?
If you want to be on the broad road with the majority thinking, and you go into the textbooks, the museums, the movies, the media, the educational system, they're going to tell you that billions of years ago, chemicals came together and they formed a little plankton or little bacteria, and that it got tired of being a bacteria and it kind of poked its head up out of the water and looked around. Well, it had to grow eyeballs first, and it became a fish, and then the fish got tired of swimming around and it turned its fins into legs and crawled up on the land, and then it turned into dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs thought it'd be nice to fly, so they turned their scales into feathers and started flying around, and others, they developed fur, and then their brains got bigger, you see, and they started hanging around in the trees and kind of scratching and hanging there and thinking, if I could just brew some beer and build some cities, it could be a people person kind of thing. And, so we got monkey people that turned into people. And, that's evolution. Now, I kind of made fun of it, okay? But that's in essence what we're being told is reality, the absolute fact of history. So two things that they do to come to this conclusion. There's biologists, geneticists that are evolutionary biologists and geneticists, and they study the molecules. And then there are paleontologists that study the rocks and the bones. And they all fit the evidence they find into a preconceived notion that obviously people weren't there one day and then suddenly people were there. That means God would have made them. The only alternative left is that something turned into a person that wasn't a person. You look around and, well, monkeys, apes, they're kind of similar, so it must have been something like them. And then some sort of four-legged creature turned into them, and something else turned into them, and it's the only alternative left. So if you reject the truth, you keep it out of your thinking, the only possibility left is that apes or ape creatures turned into people. Do you understand? So it's not a proven fact. It's a default conclusion based on the rejection of what God has told us. Now, what is the evidence? The first thing students will hear over and over and over again is that human DNA is 97, 98% identical to ape DNA. That has been repeated over and over and over again since the 1970s. Now, in the 1970s, we had not decoded DNA. We'd not pulled apart the molecule and lined it up like letters in a book. No one had done that, and yet they started making that statement. They had simply looked at one little fragment, one little molecule that was similar to that same molecule in an ape and said, look how similar they are. We must be descended from them. Lousy conclusion. But it became locked into the thinking of researchers. It's still being repeated, but there's a game that's being played. We can now take the human DNA code, and a code has a code maker. The DNA language, a language has a language maker. That's all just kind of glossed over and ignored. It's exactly like a book. The coded information on DNA, every definition of a language fits the DNA code. It has a sequence of information that's non-repeated. It's in a specific pattern. It carries information. It causes things to happen. All the definitions of what a language does. Every language is written by an intelligence. It never happens randomly. So it's like a book, page after page after page of information.
It'd be like your magic can, putting in thousands of reams of paper,
letters,
and then and putting in the firecracker,
Kaboom!
And out comes the Bible.
Exactly. That's what you're expecting to happen. But they think it happened a little bit at a time. Bacteria have about 1 million letters. The human DNA has 3 billion letters, 3,000 times more than a bacteria, okay? So it's a whole big stack of books, all right? We've now decoded that stack. We can line it all up just like a book, letter after letter after letter. We've done the same thing with apes. Chimpanzees lined up their letters. They have about 3 billion, letter after letter after letter. When you just line by line, word by word, chapter by chapter, line up the letters, there are a billion differences between us and apes. Not 1%, not 2%, 30-some% difference. What they do, they only select the areas they say, well, these are the important areas that are similar, and they're still really similar. Well, you know, we all breathe the same air. Apes eat plants, we eat plants. You know, they eat meat sometimes, we eat meat. They have hair, we have hair. They have 4 limbs, we have 4 limbs. There's gonna be lots of coding similarities, but they're totally 100% different creatures. And we now know that, but students are still led to believe because they only select the areas that are similar that we're 90% similar.
So the billion areas where they're dissimilar.
They're just ignored.
Yeah.
They
Yeah,
said,
so-
well, these aren't important
Yeah,
areas.
a billion facts we're going to ignore.
These
billion
aren't protein
facts.
coding areas that are of relevance. So there's, see, students, always ask yourself, what aren't you being told? Because your textbooks are written by someone with a certain perspective, that God has never literally created people. What aren't they telling you about the Miller's experiment, about this?
Right.
Now, let's
and that's
look at
what
bones.
the
Go ahead.
value of your books
They
here.
are, yes.
Because you are really, you're asking these questions. You're putting out evidence
others.
that there is, there's no explanation for outside of there being a creator.
Yeah, and it's not just me. I am just sharing what very, very talented technical scientific researchers who have studied creation from a biblical perspective, the conclusions they have come to, and
Yes,
why.
you've compiled it.
Yes.
You've done it in a beautiful way. The color pictures, everything about this is magnificent.
And everything I do is meant not to turn someone into a scientist, but to take things that can be complex issues like proteins and DNA and help them understand it on a very man on the street, level. It's just because God wants the truth to be known. Now, let's look at the bones, because that's where the real evidence for evolution is. It's in the fossils. That's what people are trained. And they will go to the Smithsonian Institute or museums or textbooks, and they'll see these skulls. I mean, here's a picture, if you look here, of bones lined up. They look like very sloped foreheads on these really ape-like creatures, monkeys essentially. And then you see the skulls getting bigger and the slope getting more steep and more domed foreheads. And then it just looks like a perfect sequence from ape to man, and students are shown this. What are they supposed to conclude? Must be a scientific fact. Apes have turned into people. Well, let's look at a different example, and then I'm going to come back and talk about those specific skulls, that Lucy and Australopithecines and Homo habilis and all these technical names that sound really scientific. Let's just look at another set of creatures, because I want folks to understand, how do these scientists think? I mean, most of them I don't think are dishonest. They've been trained to think in a certain way. So suppose I'm a paleontologist, okay? That's someone who studies the ancient remains of creatures that used to be alive, and they've been fossilized and they're found in the ground. And that's why I brought my skulls here. I suppose I'm digging way down in the rock layer, and way down under rock layer after rock layer after rock layer, I find this guy. Now, he looks pretty vicious, doesn't he? You know, if I'm the first one to find him, maybe I get to name him in Latin name. I'll call him a Bruceosaurus or something. And he has big teeth, so I assume he's, a vicious meat eater. Well, that's an assumption. Remember, what is an assumption? I just have an animal that used to be alive that's been trapped in sediment that's turned to rock. That's the only thing I have. It doesn't come with a label attached. Panda bears have huge, sharp teeth, even more vicious than this. They're not meat eaters, they're not carnivores. God said there was no death at the beginning of creation. That arose after mankind sinned. Animals started eating each other, death entered all of creation. The whole creation changed so we wouldn't live forever separated from him. But anyway, I find this creature, okay? Now I keep digging, and let's suppose I find this one further up in the rock layers. Similar shape, right? But much smaller. I've found lots of them. I know he's full grown, and this one's full grown. Why is he a different size? And this one has one ridge at the top. This one has 2 ridges at the top, so they're a little different. He's changed. Evolution has happened. Well, that's what I'm going to conclude. Maybe there's lots of trees in that fossil rock layer. The little one can hide behind the trees better, peek out around them and, hide from predators. So he has an advantage, and he makes more copies of himself that are smaller. So the big one has evolved into a smaller one. I've explained where he came from. Now let's suppose I keep digging, and that one's been found deep down, and this one's been found further up, and even further up I find this guy. Now notice his brain. It is getting bigger. He's getting smarter. But he's also got this really long jaw. Where'd that come from? Well, maybe he's used his brain to dig underneath like trees and rocks and get little, rodents and bugs and stuff. And the longer his jaw gets, the better he is at digging. And the bigger his brain gets, the better he is at figuring this out. So he's evolved these little changes over millions of years, and this guy has changed into a different kind of guy. Evolution has happened. Here they are, right there in the rock layers. I've proven it. But then I get super excited because I find this guy way up high in the rock layers. And he has this huge domed forehead, kind of like the human being has a big domed forehead.
Right.
So he must be like the Einstein of these kind of creatures, really, really smart. But he's so teeny, he's got to have a big brain to survive, and that's how he survived, with his big brain. Now, see what I've done? I'm a scientist. I have looked at the evidence, I've drawn my observations, and I have proven, using these observations, that evolution has happened.
I'll give you your PhD.
There we go.
Publish that one.
But what have I really done? I've made up a story. I have no time machine. I don't know how for sure those creatures got in those rocks. I don't know how for sure those rock layers formed. I was not there to see it happen. I've just made up a story that fits my worldview. It all made itself. Now let me show you what these creatures really are. The first one, if you look at that picture, is a gray wolf. Okay? Now, I'm going to come back to him in a moment, but when God created a kind of creature, he put lots of variety within the DNA code of that creature so they didn't all come out like cookie cutters. And wolves that were smaller or bigger or had a lot of different sized tails would fit different environments and could fill this creation that God had created because of the coding he put into the wolf. The second creature is a fox. That is simply a variation of the wolf that was already created into the DNA of the wolf to begin with. That's not evolution per se, it's just variation within a kind. The third one wasn't smarter, it was a bulldog. We as human beings bred away everything that didn't look like a bulldog, bred dogs together that had longer and longer jaws. All that information was already in the wolf, and we just came up with a little subset of the information already there to begin with, and we called it the bulldog. And the last one, he wasn't the Einstein of these kind of creatures. This is a stupid little chihuahua, okay? He wouldn't survive for weeks out there in the forest with the wolf. But the information for the chihuahua was already in the wolf. No change in body structure, no evolution as students are taught to think about it happened. It's just variation within a kind of creature God created. Now look at the variety. Look at the enormous variety built into the code of one kind of creature. This is way different than ape skulls and human skulls. When they line up those skulls, there's this huge gap where we have had varieties of humans. We had giants, probably 10 foot tall in the Old Testament, and even after the flood, there was still some of these in the genetic makeup of human beings. We have humans with more sloped foreheads than others. In the Congo, we have pygmies where their average height of the male is 4.5 feet tall. In the same country, there's a tribe where the average height is 6.5 feet tall. Enormous variety, okay?
Right.
Apes have enormous variety. There were apes that have went extinct, chimpanzees that went extinct. We find those in this rock layers that will talk about the worldwide flood and why it exists later. But we find this variety, we line them up, and we assume this proves evolution. It proves it no more than if I lined up a tricycle and a bicycle and a motorcycle and a car and said this proves all by itself the tricycle turned into the car. Totally different structures, totally different creatures, just variations of transportation. Doesn't prove anything.
In Darwin's observations, when he's looking at the birds, the variations of the birds on the island and all.
Right.
Nowhere near what we're seeing just in dogs. And everyone, because it is a domestic pet, But really, from the Great Pyrenees to the Chihuahua,
Right.
all of that information is
in the wolf.
in that animal, in that wolf.
Yeah,
and
it
they
is.
man just kept on breeding different things. Dr. Doberman, 7 different kind of dogs.
Right.
And this is what he has finally developed into the Doberman Pinscher.
That's right. And by the way, when Darwin was kind of developing his theory, and he even called it a theory, it's turned into a scientific fact, which it isn't. It's
Right.
okay. It's evolved. Okay.
Right.
One of his primary evidences was at the Galapagos Islands. He saw these finches. They had different shaped beak than the ones on the mainland, and he said, "Well, how can this be? It's the same basic bird." Maybe that beak gave them an advantage because there's different seed pods, different kind of flowers, different vegetation on the island. So the ones that had that kind of beak, they took over the majority of the population. It now turns out even that evidence was wrong, because it reverts itself back and forth. When there's a drought, certain plants, they're dominant. The bird beaks change to fit the majority of the seeds.
So part of the creator's plan
to
of
make
how
animals
to
survive.
Yeah.
It
that's
allows the
incredible.
survival of different characteristics by making
So
those
it's not survival of the fittest, it's actually within the genetic code to make them adaptable in different environments then.
But what scientists do, who have a philosophical viewpoint that human beings could not have been created, that couldn't have happened, because we don't see it happening today. It's not scientifically testable, but
right.
it's the best scientific explanation. They assume that these little changes, which we do see, extended over billions of years, can explain the big changes. But we've never seen that. We've never seen useful, functioning, complex information added to a DNA chain. Just like you never see an explosion adding information to a book.
Right,
or
right.
randomly taking a pen and marking out letters, or randomly rearranging letters, making it a better, more well-functioning, more well-read, more complex book. It can't happen, nor can it happen in biological evolution. And we don't see that. Variation within a kind, yes. Whole new body structures, whole new types of animals, never. We never see it. Now, let me give you one more example. I got a few more minutes. Let's talk about DNA.
Okay.
Hand me the zipper. Thank you. This is kind of little model of DNA. Now, geneticists are learning more and more and more about the human body and how it functions and how it operates. And the complexity every year goes up in probably an order of magnitude in how complex we understand even a simple cell is. But all traits, all genetic characteristics, they're passed on from one animal or human being to the next generation via the coded information in our book, which we call DNA. Now this zipper represents the DNA code. You'll see there's 4 colors here. There's yellow, blue, green, and red, and they're lined up in a certain sequence. Now, to make the parts of our body, to make a cell function, it has thousands of proteins that are built from the information on the DNA. You know, there's all sorts of little machines that come, and there's a little machine that unzips the zipper, okay? To get the coded information off of the DNA, you've got to open up the DNA. You've got to unzip the zipper. Okay, that's why I'm using this analogy. It's a very good and accurate analogy. And then another little machine comes and it lines itself up and it grabs exactly those sequence of what we would call letters. It goes and grabs the raw material and the mechanisms, and it creates the protein that is needed to build the cell or do whatever's happening. And there's hundreds of thousands of these different sequences of information. So you follow the process. That's how our bodies are built. That's how cells are built. You got to open up the DNA, get the information off the DNA to build each of these cells and maintain our lives. Well, it turns out the only way to open up a DNA molecule is to have a zipper pull, a specifically designed molecule. Like a zipper pull has to be used to open and shut the DNA. That's a protein. Okay, but the only way to make the protein is if you have a way to open up the DNA. But the only way to open up the DNA is if you already have the protein. But the only way to make the protein is if you can get the DNA open. Are you following what I'm telling you? You can't even make the pieces and parts of our body until the pieces and parts of our body are already there to get the DNA information. It all has to be there at once. There's an old riddle called what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, that's how we had the spontaneous generation.
Yeah, you understand, I needed this guy. He was part of my teaching tool, paraphernalia. The riddle goes like this: what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because when you understand the biological process as a farmer, to get a chicken, you've got to have an egg. You can't just get a chicken somewhere. You got to have an egg and hatch it and have a chicken. But you can never have an egg unless you first have a chicken to lay the egg. And every chicken that's formed already has, the eggs inside of it. They're already formed inside of the chicken, and then it just starts laying them, they're fertilized and they're laid and so on. So inside of the chicken, the egg already exists. They're already in the chicken to make the next generation. And you can't get the next generation. It all has to be there at once. Everything in biology is like that, right down to the molecular level of the DNA. You can't even make the parts you need for the cell until you get the DNA open, but you can't do that until you have the information on the DNA. It is, you see why God does things this way? So we would know the truth. We couldn't possibly miss it unless we choose to be willfully ignorant to what He's put in front of us.
And I think that's what Bertrand Russell, really the conclusion he came to think the opposite of evolution, it's just unthinkable. It just wouldn't allow his mind to go there, that there's a creator,
Right.
and that we would be ultimately responsible to, that there is a morality that's
Absolutely.
built into the composition of the human race.
Yeah, well stated. And another simple truth, but it's profound. When you start by leaving the truth out, you're guaranteed to end up believing something that's a lie. Because your starting assumption is human beings weren't just created. Your starting assumption is some natural process made it. Your starting assumption, if it is, there have been millions and billions of years of history, you're gonna misinterpret everything around us. So that's what's going on all around us. And it has profound implications in education and how people have been trained to think.
Some other examples from your books, as far as the complexity of life and the DNA code. Really, it's just been in the last 20 years, really, that this is coming to the forefront. As far as
it is.
being
We're
able
learning
to decode it.
I think we really are in the last days, Michael, and I've noticed throughout the Old Testament, before God, it goes to the last resort as a parent, is in some sort of corporal punishment. You're trying to train children to for their own benefit, what is the right way to behave? What is going to bring fulfillment and happiness in life? God is like that. He works with us and works with us, puts the truth in front of us, makes things absolutely crystal clear, and then, as a last resort, he'll bring judgment upon us to wake us up. I think right now, in the last few decades, the truth, by studying creation, has become unbelievably apparent and obvious. We know more about the structure of cells and DNA and genetics. We know more about the fossil record. We're going to talk about all these layers of rocks and fossils in a future episode than ever before in history. And they all line up with a straightforward, clear understanding of God's Word. These books that I've produced, this is a devotional where every day is just some fun, interesting creature that God has made. One page is about God invented the first disposable diaper. Did you know that? It's one of the pages in the book. Baby songbirds, when they are born, they're in these very, very tight nests, hidden from predators. But when the mothers bring them worms, they just almost immediately poop. And if, that nest would fill up with sewage. The predators would smell it. It would be unhealthy. What's God going to do about this? Turns out, only the babies, when songbirds defecate or when they poop, they surround it with a little sack, a little impermeable sack. The mother gives them a worm, grabs that little sack, which is like a disposable diaper, and flies off and drops it out in the field. And then when the birds learn to fly, they quit making this membrane and they quit having diapers. I mean, you don't want to be wearing diapers when you're grown up, do you? God designed all of this. How does that happen by chance? He designed it even for the birds of the air He cares about. How much more He cares about each of us.
Bruce, let's talk about peer pressure for a moment, because we know that as far as in school, everyone has to conform.
Right.
And this is what we learn right from kindergarten. These are the expectations. Everyone conforms. We don't argue with our teachers, etc. Evolution, it's the accepted fact. But you go all the way up to the university level, you're really not allowed to think outside of that box. Isn't peer pressure and making a living also being manipulated by this?
Well, yeah, just the answer is yes. But let me end with a very poignant story from history of how an entire culture can be trained to be deceived by something as simple as beauty. I'm going to take you back to the 1800s. In France, painting was a profession like the medical profession is today. Painters were trained to paint it in only a certain way. All those old paintings of biblical scenes and battles, very, very formal. There were a group of painters called the Impressionists, Monet and Picasso and others, that wanted just paint the image of beauty versus this formal painting. They were locked out of the system. Once a year, they had a gathering called the Salon in Paris, France, where 1 million people would come and see the best of the best artwork. None of these people's paintings were allowed in there, and they were scoffed at when they were looked at. Now, every museum in the world today has an Impressionist area, and it is beautifully done artwork. But an entire society was trained, this is ugly because it doesn't fit the system. They had to go around the system, set up their own art show. Today, there were about 10,000 paintings in the Salon shows. They had about 100 in their show. Their 100 paintings in that original art show is today worth in excess of $1 billion, and every museum in the world has a display of Impressionist paintings because they were beautiful. But an entire society had been trained to think, this is art, this isn't, this is pretty, this isn't, and they couldn't even see it in any other way because they're trained to think in that way. That's how peer pressure affects even our perception of beauty, let alone reality, science, and history. Our children are worth more than $1 billion, and they're being trained to reject God's word. We've got to go around an established system that leaves God out and get the truth in front of them and the evidence that supports that truth.
Well, we're going to go deeper into this. We are going to go into the flood, because without the flood and the table of nations and what has happened, we really can't understand human civilization.
We can't. And we can't explain the rest of science.
So we're going to be back, and we're going to do that, ladies and gentlemen. The treat has just begun, where we're going to continue on from Genesis 1:1. We are going to go into the flood. So be back with us as we continue our journey into Foundations in the Torah 101. But now I would like to close with prayer. Yivarechecha Yehovah vayishmerecha. Yair Yehovah panavelecha v'yichunecha. Yisa Yehovah panavelecha v'yisem lecha shalom. B'shem Yeshua HaMashiach Sar Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, Torah fans. Shavua Tov. Have a good week. We will see you back here, Foundations in the Torah, on Shabbat Night Live.